This is a war. Wars in themselves are destructive in nature and they're tragedies. And when we think about the institution of slavery, it itself is a tragedy. And you think about just being alive in the 19th century, it's difficult. Then throw on top of it a war and all the chaos and bedlam that breaks out here. You get a chance, I think, here to think about where we stand in 2024. Objectively, the greatest time to be alive. Longer health, better health, longer lifespans, all those things. Think about the forebears that went before us. Think about what was at stake. And I think reflect when you hear people today say silly things like, we're going to have another civil war, or this is so bad, or we're so divided. You get a chance to stand in a place where we really were divided.
Yeah.
And then when you look back 160 years, you realize maybe we're not as divided as people like to argue. And there's no central issue that is as divisive as the institution of slavery was in 1860.
All right. That's from the man
He's
himself,
good.
Joseph.
He's good. He's like really good.
Yeah, man. That was that was last year. I came out to Nashville, Tennessee. I was on a little bit of a road trip and I was heading down the interstate there, catching some concerts along the way, and my buddy Rich Condon put me in contact with Joseph, and he said, "Hey, this is the guy you need to talk to about Franklin when you go out there." So, Joseph, welcome to the channel.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me. Sorry about not realizing the Central Eastern time zone divide there. That was on me. Yeah, yeah,
Hey, it's okay. It's absolutely okay. So, Joseph, master's degree from Southeastern Louisiana University.
yeah.
You were the historian for the Battle of Franklin Trust at one point, and host of podcasts of Dispatch and Homebrew History. Are you still doing Homebrew History?
Oh yeah, and homebrew history is big, exciting stuff. We're about to go back to being a weekly podcast.
Awesome.
So we're amping up for a really, really big 2025. Yeah.
Outstanding. So how is it? How is it for yourself? Working for a place like Franklin with so much history and having to be so involved on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I guess spoiler, I should say I no longer work in Franklin. But to have been in a place like that where uh, storytelling is a part of it, but the story itself is the reason that you end up there. Um, I can say from kind of now three perspectives. One, having not worked there,
Yeah.
worked there, and now post working there.
Right.
There's no other place like it in the country. The town itself is unique, and it's got all these little kind of quirks and sort of ins and outs of it that are incredible and fun to experience and to learn about. But the stories of the McGavicks and of the Carters, and even down south in Spring Hill of the Chairs family and the battles of Spring Hill and Franklin. Uh, I mean, they were important enough to me to move there in 2021, and they're important enough to me now in 2025, no longer being there, to still read about and uh, still find interesting and still want to write about. Yeah.
Outstanding. So where exactly are you from originally?
So I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. I was born in New Orleans, and I went to school in Hammond, Louisiana. Got my bachelor's and my master's degree. And then in 2021, we moved to Tennessee, and now we're back in Hammond, Louisiana. Hey, look at that. It's JD, History Underground. What a
Yeah,
guy.
JD's out there. Very cool. So growing up in a town like that, I guess maybe it's kind of easy for a kid to get an appreciation for history.
Yeah, I think I told you this. Is like I felt like I never had a chance. This was just going to happen.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, I used to joke with people as like, yeah, my mom and dad, other kids went to Disney World. My mom and dad brought me to Antietam. I
Yeah.
went to Gettysburg twice, type of thing. I didn't get to. My flat Stanley didn't go to boring places like a beach. It went to battlefields.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe Flash Stanley wore a uniform.
He might have a couple of times at least. Yeah.
So what would you say, is it the family trips that got you started with that passion?
I think that. Um, and then too, it was just the thing that I was always more interested in.
Yeah.
I can vividly remember telling my first grade teacher in social studies class, I was like, when are we going to skip all this other stuff and get to the history? And you know, I think the rest is, you use the cliche, the rest is history, as you kind of just get sunk into it that way. But always going to museums, always visiting battlefields, always reading and trying to learn as much as I could. And then too, the popular culture that surrounds history too was always really influential. Watching war movies with my dad type of thing. Uh, but then too, the type of media that you take in. So I love podcasts. That's the whole reason that we started. My old college roommate and I started a podcast, a history podcast, was because this is the type of stuff that I want to listen to, and I'm sure if I want to listen to it, there's other people
Right.
that want to listen to something else, and there's other topics that we can talk about that maybe they're not being covered somewhere else, so we'll do them ourselves.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and I think they're pretty important too. I mean, a kid can get on the internet and watch 27 hours of somebody else playing a video game, or
Yeah,
they can get on the internet and learn a little something. So,
yeah.
so you spend a lot of time in college getting an education. Obviously, you have that master's degree, and you put a lot of work in for that. What's it like once you finally get that? You have all that education under your belt. You're working really hard towards something, and then boom, Franklin calls and says, "Hey, we want you to be the historian for Franklin."
Well, let's get a couple little details, right?
All right.
So I was in school, and my master's thesis was on General George Wagner
Okay.
at the Battle of Franklin. And so that was easy, right? I'd been to Franklin a couple times before then. I'd really just fallen in love with the place. And uh, my thesis advisor, she told me, you can't just write a battle history. You can't just write a narrative. You have to pick something. So I drilled down on one thing that I think most influences the battle, which is George Wagner and the advance line decisions he makes. What
Right.
happens to the Federal Army because of that? In doing so, I didn't realize that I would become friends with the CEO, Eric Jacobson.
Okay.
And Eric and I were texting each other kind of on and off and emailing each other back and forth on and off. And I guess maybe 2 or 3 weeks before I graduated, I emailed him and said, here's my resume, here's a CV. I know this is a long shot, but if you're ever looking for somebody to come to work there, I'd love to do it.
Yeah.
I was teaching at the time, wasn't really a perfect fit for what I was doing. Um, and the school that I was at decided, probably actually for the best that you don't keep teaching. It just wasn't what I wanted.
Right.
Um, and Eric emailed me the last week of May and said, if you can get here by June 15th, you have a job. And so, I mean, literally, I sold a bunch of books, moved a bunch of stuff out of the way, rented a U-Haul. My wife and I were engaged, before she was my wife, my fiance and I were engaged at the time. And I just said, like, hey, I got to go. I got to do this. And she was
Right.
really supportive. So we moved up there, and I started as a historical interpreter.
Yeah.
So just, your normal guide, just doing house tours, and then eventually got skilled into extended tours, which is like a 90-minute version of the house tour. And then one day, Eric, there was a battlefield tour that had been set, and there was nobody else around to give it. And Eric looked at me and he goes, well, you could just do it. And so for my first battlefield tour, I was flying by the seat of my pants, just kind of like,
Yeah.
hey, what do you want to know about? Let's see what.
That's
Um,
cool.
and so after 2 years of that, I was promoted to be the staff historian.
Yeah.
So I worked archival research. Managed a little bit of the data collection. I did all the descendants paperwork and everything. And that was a really just a great time. I planned a lot of events, including all the anniversary commemorations, and then to uh, these kind of lecture series events that we did throughout the year. Very
Right.
similar to our roundtable. And now, I think, in large part because of our involvement with that, the Battle of Franklin Trust now manages the Franklin Civil War Roundtable, which is an incredible opportunity for the people that are in the roundtable and people that visit the sites to kind of see how that kind of a partnership can work.
That's pretty cool. So you're out there on the battlefield, and you're obviously you're doing tours every other day, however often you're doing a tour, and you're getting more familiar with the terrain. what's the one of the biggest impediments to somebody coming out to that field whenever they get out there? Because for me, when I got there, I've been there maybe twice total,
Mhm.
and the biggest impediment that I found was the fact that it's, there's so many buildings, there's so many places in the way, and just the visualization of what took place there is just not,
Mhm.
you can't really bring it all in. What would you
Mm,
say is kind of the impediment for you?
I don't know. Um, I'll be honest with you. I think once I walked it enough, you do it every day. I
Right.
lived there. I lived literally 10 minutes from the battlefield, so I'd drive over, park somewhere, and I just walk. Even if I was walking through the neighborhood, I'd just walk there and just see, kind of familiarize myself with the ground a little bit better. Um, I think one of the problems that occurs is when people have read about Franklin in a book,
Hmm.
or maybe all they've done is watch the YouTube channel, the Battle of Franklin Trust YouTube channel, or even the American Battlefield Trust stuff. One of the biggest challenges is everything makes it look level and makes
Yeah.
it look like it's a big open flat field. And every map
Right.
you look at, big open flat field. The 1899, the 1903, and 1905 images, the current images make it look like a big open flat field. But when you really start getting around and you're on the ground all the time, you can really start to see there's these little undulations, these little disturbances in the ground. And you can actually track how it changes the more and more familiar you get with it. So the eastern side of the battlefield is vastly different than the midsection of the battlefield, and the western flank is completely different than anywhere else. So it's just I don't know. I think it's a place that if you go there enough times and you put out of your mind all of the buildings and all of the stuff, the fact of the matter is that some of that stuff is there and it'll be there for probably our lifetimes.
Yeah.
Although, reclamation, like JD said in his comment, is one of the greatest stories there.
Right.
Um, I don't know. I think when you're there enough, you can put all that out of your mind and really just let the ground that you're on, if it's saved or not, speak to you.
Yeah. So I had a viewer ask a question, wanted to know, um, why do you think John Bell Hood continues to pursue after such a terrible defeat at the Battle of Franklin?
That's a good question. I mean, my
Mhm.
my thought on this has changed maybe 4 or 5 times just since I've started uh, reading and researching about it. Now almost a decade ago.
Mhm.
Um, I guess my best answer I can give you is what else was he supposed to do? You know, is he
Right.
just supposed to turn around, go home, pack it up? Well, no, because then the army disintegrates. Uh, and with hindsight, we can look back and say, oh, that was a terrible decision. I can't believe he did that. Uh, but if you're John Bell Hood, you have to weigh the cost. Well, you could try and get up to Nashville, try and force something to happen there.
Yeah.
Now, it's hard. It's hard to rationalize that in
Right.
160 years later. Uh, but fighting at Franklin, I get it. Fighting at Spring Hill, I get it. Fighting at Franklin, I understand. Nashville's a harder sell, but I still think that when Hood gets there, his hope is to try and draw Thomas out, fight it piecemeal, and it's just not going to happen the way that he had hoped and set up that it could and would.
Right.
Um, but all that said, the alternative is if he turns south, the army will fall apart. The
Yeah.
army will simply disintegrate. Now, there is always the great what if of what if he had gone to Murfreesboro. Well, he maybe seizes some supplies, pins himself in Murfreesboro, but there's not much that he can really do there. He's not a threat to anyone in Murfreesboro. He may threaten the rail yards and the rail lines in and out of Nashville, but it's not really something that's going to secure what he needs, which is a decisive, uh, victorious thrust in the Western theater. And he just those days are gone. We could argue that they're probably gone in February of 1862
Yeah.
after Grant takes Henry and Donelson. They're certainly gone after Atlanta falls in 64. And if they're not gone by then, you know, I don't know what you're looking at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's talk about that advanced line you were talking about earlier. That advanced line is such a huge part of all of this. Without that advanced line there, this battle might have turned into something completely different. What's your take on that?
Um, well, I guess the first problem is I can't tell you what it would have been like if it wasn't there because it was
Right.
there.
Yeah.
Maybe Wagner's division's in the center, maybe they're in reserve. Who knows? Uh, but they are out front, and it's two brigades, strong brigades, 3,500 men total, maybe 3,600, under Colonel John Lane and Joseph Conrad, both good soldiers, not necessarily experienced brigade commanders, but good soldiers. Their troops are decent. They're not all veterans, but they've all been around the block. Um, and then there are some new recruits kind of sprinkled in here and there, but good, well trained, well placed troops. And when again, this is one of those things when you get familiar with the ground, you start to realize that maybe the advanced line isn't such a terrible position after all.
Yeah.
I'm going to do this with my hands because it's the only way I can really explain it. You've got Carter Hill here
Right.
on the south side of Franklin, and then the ground kind of drops down a little bit. That's Columbia Pike heading out towards the advanced line. It picks back up and then immediately drops off. And Wagner's troops are right here. They're on the south side of the drop off. The ground drops again and then picks up at Privet Knob and then
Yeah.
drops off and goes toward Winstead Hill where it picks up again. So, uh, what's the problem if you're on the main line? Well, you can't see all the way to the south side of town. You can't see beyond maybe where Wagner's line is. Today it's Battle Avenue. If you can see beyond Carolyn, Fairground, Battle Avenue area,
Right.
maybe, but you certainly can't see past Privet Knob.
Yeah.
And that's only a distance of about a mile. And so if you're on the main line, what you want effectively is somebody out in front that can see further south. So Wagner's division makes sense. They were some of the last troops to come in because they're the rear guard from their nice retreat from Spring Hill. So it makes sense to be deployed there.
Okay.
But I think the problem is not that they're there. The problem is that they're there for maybe a moment too soon or a moment too
Okay.
late. And that becomes the big controversy. Well, what was
Right.
George Wagner thinking? Was he stupid? Was he drunk? He's none of those things. He's a
Right.
human being. He, like you and I, made a mistake. I think we can sit back and look at our lives and go, here's every mistake I've ever made. That, I think the same level, the same measure of examination is what we should employ to a man like George Wagner, who, I wrote about this for the emerging Civil War a couple of weeks ago, was one of those volunteer soldiers that we always think about. The men of 1861 who donned
Yeah.
Union blue and went on to fight and save the country. Um, I don't think he should get a bad rap for, one single mistake on the worst day of his life.
Yeah. No, no doubt. Well, even with that mistake, I know they talk about the casualty rate because of where he was at and how long he stayed there. But even with that, we're talking what, like 2,300 Union casualties in totality for
Yeah,
the fight there, and then the
yeah,
Confederate was over 6,000 casualties.
yeah, close to 7,000. Yeah,
Yeah, so that's
yeah, we
that's a
can call it. We
massive
can,
difference.
round it 7,500.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not, again, it's one of those things where it could have created a much larger problem than it
Yeah.
did, and it didn't. Um, but I think it remains controversial, if only because when you surround that story with as much kind of scandalous material as people have over the last, century and a half, Wagner was drinking. No, he wasn't, but you say it enough times and you believe it.
Right.
He was incompetent. No, he was very competent. But if you tell yourself he was dumb, you'll believe it. And the myth making about George Wagner and the myth making, for that matter, about John Bell Hood,
Yeah.
who I should always kind of give credit, is the reason I got involved with the Franklin story. Was I've always kind of had this weird fascination with a guy who lost an arm and lost a leg, and I don't know. I guess I like underdogs. I have no clue. Uh, but the first time I went to Franklin, I remember the tour guide, no names, right? But I remember he looked around and he told people that this was a battle between a drug addict and a drunk. And I was like, well, clearly there's got to be more to it than that,
Yeah.
you know? Um, so that's what got it all started. And then Wagner kind of grew into his own thing. And now, I don't know, now I guess he's one of my, I was told I have to stop being so nice about him because I'm nicer to George Wagner, who's dead, than I am to people who are alive. Uh, but I guess those are the breaks when you're a historian, you surround yourself with dead people.
Yeah. 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 All the time.
Yeah.
So John Bell Hood post Civil War,
Mm.
I like digging up stories about these people and try to find out what they went on to do with their lives. And post Civil War, John Bell Hood's life was not great.
It was a wonderful. I actually wrote about this for an emerging Civil War book. They Came Only to Die by Sean Chick. Um, I've known Sean for a long time, so he asked me to write about Hood's post-war years. Um, but after the war, I guess we pick up, December, right? Gets the army out of Nashville, south, back over the Tennessee River into Alabama, and then makes his way to Mississippi, and holds up there in Tupelo. Resigns January 23rd, 1865. Makes his way to Richmond, and he gets orders from Jefferson Davis to go to Texas and try and raise an army to keep the war going. And he makes
Hmm.
it to Natchez, Mississippi, and he's captured. I think it's May 6th, May 9th, 1865. And he was sent to prison in New Orleans, paroled there. And while he's there, he either got in touch with John H. Reagan while he was in New Orleans or shortly thereafter. But Reagan had been the Postmaster General for the Confederate government. Uh, he effectively offered Hood a job as a land manager in San Antonio, Texas. So Hood makes his way back to Texas. Really, it's not the greatest work for a man in his condition. The
Hmm.
arm is healing and is fine, and he can use the arm with some limitations, but it's the leg that becomes a bit of a problem. Being constantly on horseback and all the moving and the never really seeming to be static. It's hard. It's hard work. Um, so by 1866, makes his way to New Orleans, and by 1868, marries a woman from my new hometown, adopted hometown, Hammond, Louisiana, a woman
Hmm.
named Anna Marie Hennon, Anna Hennon Hood. And the two go on to start a family. Hood becomes an investor on the New Orleans Cotton Exchange. So if you think about, kind of a Wall Street man, but dealing in the cotton commodities in the city, it's a great economic engine, this massive machine, um, and makes a lot of money in uh, that position. Becomes a father, and then eventually a father 11 times, including three sets of twins, and that's all just shy of a decade, if not a little bit more than a decade. Um, but yeah, 1874, following the Battle of Liberty Place during the Reconstruction movement, the Metropolitan Police commander, James Longstreet, is effectively forced out of the city. And Longstreet turns to Hood to take over his position with the American Life Insurance Company. And that
Hmm.
puts Hood on the road all the time. I mean, he's
Right.
traveling all over the place. And I think what's interesting is that while John Bell Hood never really comes out and says it, just black and white, it's based on some of the context clues. Uh, his politics are probably not much different than James Longstreet. Not so
Okay.
much that he's maybe an out and out Republican, but there's a speech that he gives in Charleston, South Carolina, and he effectively says, we have to fight the Ku Kluxers. We can't let them, dominate Reconstruction. Now, granted, some of the language that he uses throughout that's the kind of very paternalistic Reconstruction era talk of, well, it's, we held held on to slavery. So now we must find a way to raise up the slave. It is our, our responsibility, our duty, all these things. And he's talking in these very paternalistic, very patronizing ways, but it's not what, say, the Wade Hamptons of the world or the Jubal Earleys of the world are saying.
Right.
And Hood also seems to be very hat in hand, uh, content with the result of
Okay.
the war. I guess if you look at his wartime experience, you could argue that there's probably no other officer in the ranks of the Confederacy that gave as much physically, and mentally, as he did. Uh, I would contend that there's nobody else out there that really gives up quite as much as he does, especially in the terms of his body. Um, but when the war's over, he effectively understands it's over. You know,
Yeah.
South
Yeah.
lost, Confederacy's lost. We have to move on now. And so he strives, I think, in that regard, to try and put the war behind him. Uh,
Sure.
Varying levels of success, right?
Yeah.
He'll always stay involved with veterans. He'll always stay involved with the Hood's Texas Brigade that eventually forms as a reunion society. Um, but he travels a lot. He's away from his family a lot. And come 1878, there is a yellow fever epidemic that sweeps through the city. I mean, kills close to 300 people in the city of New Orleans.
Mm.
And the Hood family spared. No
Oh wow.
losses, no one gets sick, nothing. But the 1878 yellow fever epidemic is enough to effectively destroy the cotton industry and at the same time destroy the insurance business that Hood is in. So both
Yeah.
of those things go bust. All of Hood's monetary assets are effectively just depleted. Um, so then along comes 1879. Now, the only way to really combat yellow fever in 1878, 1879 is to simply not be in the areas where you are prone to contract it from mosquito-borne, illnesses. So you don't want to be near stagnant, dirty water. Uh, the problem is that New Orleans sits under the sea level, so it kind of constantly collects water, and there's
Yeah.
always some stagnant flow somewhere. Um, so to avoid it, you leave. But to leave, you have to have money to do it.
Right.
Um, and they take a chance yet again in 1879. This time, I think there's only a handful of people, maybe it's 10, 12 people that pass away from the yellow fever epidemic of 79. Uh, but three of them, the last name is Hood.
Oh.
John Bell, his wife Anna, and their oldest daughter,
Mm.
Lydia. All three of them pass away within days of one another. There's a really just God heartbreaking account from Walter Crouch, who was with Hood in his last days. And it's right after his wife died, right after the funeral for his wife. He said to Crouch, I've never had the fever, but if I should, I have nothing left to live for. You know, this is a man who has 10 or 11 children, a
Yeah.
newborn, um, but he's just lost the the love of his life, the woman that he married, and the very next day he falls ill, and August 30th, 1879, he's dead. And then begins the fight over his legacy. And there's a
Yeah.
great book by Brian Craig Miller's John Bell Hood, Fight for Civil War Memory. That is, if you're going to understand Hood, that is necessary reading.
Outstanding. Yeah, that story. Reading up on it just when you look at what happened to these guys, no matter what side they're fighting on, when you look at what happened to a lot of them after the war's over with, I mean, it's a lot of twists and turns with their stories. Now, as far as Franklin's concerned, when I go out to battlefields, I have places I go to that are extremely special to me. Maybe it was that first time I came over the ridge line and saw something and it just shocked me. Or the first time I see some earthworks in Petersburg, for example, I have a specific place I like to go to. Is there a spot in Franklin that holds that value to you? That's kind of like that special place. That's got that memory that's just locked in that you go to.
I have two.
All right.
The first one, for obvious reasons, is the advance line. there's only a little piece of the ground that's been saved. But it's a really great spot just to really go and stand there, and you can't see anything, you can't visualize anything. Um, but being there, you can at least reflect for a moment on the gravity, and maybe the desperation
Yeah.
of what happened out front. And then the second one, it's hard to beat the area at Collins Farm. So then we would call it Carton Lot number one. It's the very western edge of the McGavick's property as it butts up against what was then the Nashville and Decatur rail line.
Okay.
I'm an eastern flank junkie. That's kind of my weakness is, Pat Claiborne's overrated. I don't want to hear about him. I'm going to go over here and follow Loring's division in. And two, I guess, true to my roots, there's also the area where the only Louisiana regiment that was on really engaged in the battle fought. So with Thomas More Scott's brigades, 12th Louisiana, they trained 20 miles up the road from where I'm sitting right now. It's just an interesting piece of ground, and two, to realize how close they were there and casualties that were suffered. They're under artillery fire for basically a mile all the way to the earthworks, and then once
Mm.
they get there, it's rifle fire, small arms fire, close range canister rounds from the artillery. It's
Yeah.
a desperate piece of ground, but I think it's one of the most impressive. Certainly, I think the most moving pieces of ground is the eastern flank area. So from the park all the way over to the railroad tracks, that piece of ground, I think, is just always going to have a chunk of me kind of stuck to it.
That's good. That's good. So when I got out to Franklin, I went over to Carnton myself and just kind of walked that little trail that they have with all the different signs that are in front there. And then, of course, I checked out the mansion, the museum, and everything that's over there. And it was a curious thing for me to find out that there were a couple of soldiers. It looks like, I'm not sure how many, but maybe you can bring some light to the story. One of the worst maritime disasters inside the United States
Yeah,
had
Sultana.
happened, and some soldiers had perished on that. Their story ties into Franklin.
Yeah. So most of those men come from the center regiments in the middle of the line. So 12th and 16th Kentucky, 8th Tennessee U.S., 175th Ohio, 183rd Ohio, 44th Missouri, 50th Ohio, 72nd Illinois, 111th Ohio, 107th Illinois, and 107th Ohio, 65th Indiana, 65th Illinois, a couple of the artillery batteries. Those are the men who are in the center, would have had the most opportunities to have been captured. It's where the breakthrough happens, so there's Confederate troops that are stuck in that area. When the next morning comes, right, they find that they're abandoned. The Federal Army escapes in the middle of the night, and these soldiers are disarmed and sent further south. Some of them go to Cahaba prison camp, others go to Andersonville.
Right.
Those men who end up in Andersonville, eventually, when parole comes, are sent to Vicksburg. Then they're put on the Sultana and promised, their safe passage back home. Of course, Sultana's loaded and explodes just north of Memphis. And there's, I don't know, if you look at Eric's book, Baptism of Fire, Eric Jacobson's book, Baptism of Fire, he's got a whole list of the men who were just killed on the Sultana. But there's even men, who one of my favorite soldiers, 50th Ohio guys, Erastus Winters, he's a corporal. Winters is captured at Franklin. He writes an incredible memoir serving Uncle Sam in the 50th Ohio. And he basically says, I had been captured. I tried to fight the entire Confederate Army on my own for 24 hours. I was captured again. Then I was sent to Andersonville. He writes graphic detail about what he experiences there. Uh, and he gets to Sultana and he basically says, yep, there it was, ended up in the water. So I decided to just walk home.
Oh,
I guess when you've been captured and you've been shot at and you've been almost blown up and you've been almost drowned, you may as well, take your passage in your own hands and just walk.
yeah. I mean, it might be the safest way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that story was pretty captivating to me, and then another portion of the story that was captivating to me was on the grounds there. They broke down just how many people in the state of Tennessee actually, at one point in time, had slaves in the state of
Hmm.
Tennessee. That number to me was astronomical. I didn't know it was as high as it was.
Yeah, and to consider Tennessee didn't Tennessee had an anti-manumission law on the
Hmm.
books passed in the 1830s. So then you come to 1860, 61, the secession crisis. Uh, you you really can't avoid the fact that there's an overwhelming slave population. And two, Williamson County was like 50-50,
Yeah,
just in terms of residents. It's half free and half free, half white, half enslaved, half black. Um, yeah, and I see JD's question, so I can talk a little bit about it. I got there kind of as most of Fuller's story was coming to its kind of its end, just in terms of installment and the writing of signs and everything. But I was there, and I got to see how that unfolds. So the Fuller story really began after the events of Charlottesville in 2017. Um, and there was a prayer vigil being hosted by a white pastor named Kevin Riggs, at the base of the Confederate Monument in downtown Franklin. This is at a time when Confederate monuments are all the rage and everybody's losing their minds, and it's such a vitriolic kind of awful debate between these really really polarized sides, right? Um, so Eric Jacobson, CEO of the Battle of Franklin Trust, he went. He didn't go up to the base of the monument, right? But he stood kind of off in the distance and just wanted to see for
yeah,
himself, because there's all these rumors, right? That, oh,
right.
this is a prayer vigil, but it's Antifa, and they're going to tear the monument down. So Eric just wanted to be there, right? And after it was over, he went and he talked with Kevin Riggs, and he and Kevin then met, and basically Eric had decided it actually would be better to leave the Confederate monument, but do something else with it, right? There's so many other communities that were, uh, you know, taking down these monuments, removing them, but they weren't replacing them with anything. They weren't adding anything. They were simply removing a piece of the conversation. So Eric met with Kevin, and Kevin agreed, but Kevin and Eric both, came to the same conclusion. Kevin told Eric, it's great that you and I are in agreement, but we're both white. We
Mm,
should probably get, African American perspective, get some black voices involved. And so they did. Then they bring in Pastor Chris Williamson and Pastor Hewitt Sawyers, uh, and the four men form Fuller Story. And much of the plan bases around the fact that the city of Franklin would allow the erection of four additional signs around the base of the monument. One which talks about the monument itself, when it was dedicated, another one which talks about the Battle of Franklin, because, well, naturally, right? And then another one that talks about the lost cause and about a slave market that actually was located right in the center where the monument sits today. All that's fine and good and everything, right? And then the big kind of the piece de resistance of it all is to add another statue, another monument, and it's
okay.
right across the street from it, because one thing that I was always impressed by, and I always tried to impress upon my guests and visitors and just people who were curious, and I even found myself doing this when I would walk around downtown Franklin, after work, taking a stroll, whatever. People would be in the square and, oh wow, this is so pretty. Hey, did you know that this square has, it starts in 1799 with the founding of the town. So like, let's just think for a moment about all the history that's right here, just
Yeah,
in what we can see, right? So 1799. Well, what's going on? Well, the country's only a little bit more than 20 years old. We're growing as a nation, expanding westwards. The Constitution is just a little bit over a decade old. Tennessee's only been a state for 3 years, so we've seen statehood now. Let's see, 1803 comes the Louisiana Purchase, so we get to watch that in the square. I'm sure people were talking about that. A slave market is built right here. This happens right smack dab in the center of town. Human beings, people, individuals, people with souls and thoughts and feelings that are bought and sold like commodities right here.
yeah,
We see that. We see the War of 1812. Young men sign up, go off and volunteer and fight in Tennessee regiments from right there in Williamson County. They go off and do that. And let's see what else happens. Then we get to the 1820s and we're seeing more expansion. 1840s, we come to the Mexican War. There's rallies in downtown Franklin to promote the war. Young men again go off and fight. It's a volunteer state for a reason.
Yeah.
And then you get to the 1850s and you see the political activism that begins. And it's not so much, abolition like you would see in other places, but this is Whigs and Northern Democrats who are rallying and having discussions about the politics of slavery, its expansion in Western, and then along comes the war, right? And we get to see young men yet again go off, fight, right? And then you come along to the Battle of Franklin, and that happens in the square. And then by 1867, there's a riot that takes place in downtown Franklin. Uh, these are black men who had just received the right to vote. There was a challenge on the floor of the Tennessee State House, which said that they shouldn't be allowed this right, and that if they could prove that they could muster enough men, right? So uh, black citizens, a lot of them being former USCTs, U.S. Color Troop soldiers,
Yeah.
don their uniforms. They're in downtown Franklin. All of a sudden, gunshots ring out from the windows of the John House dry goods store, and
Hmm.
thus sparks the Franklin riot.
Yeah.
Then 20 years later, there's a lynching of a man named Amos Miller. He's hanged from the balcony of the county courthouse. The Ku Klux Klan forms a den right there in Franklin, right in the town square. And then you have the erection of the Confederate Monument in 1899. You have the memorialization and monumentation on the battlefield. That's all happening in the town, around the square, all these things. And then so several years it goes kind of dormant. Franklin's doing its own thing, growing as a suburb of Nashville. It's got its own kind of sort of ritzy community growing out of it. Um, then along comes 2009, the sites start being saved, battlefield reclamation becomes such a crucial part of the story.
Right.
And then in 2017, there's, the fuller stories begun. And in October of 2021, right? Yeah, October 2021, the Fuller Story Monument, the March to Freedom, is unveiled. And then from that point forward, now you stand in the square and you're surrounded by 200 plus years of American history that you can
That's real
read
neat.
about, you can write about. Um, but you can also see these things, I think, as a piece of art, right?
Yeah.
So you can look at the Confederate monument from a certain angle from the March to Freedom, and you can see that this is it's an ongoing battle, right, over monumentation and memory, but at the same time it's also sort of a reckoning in a way, which I've always find those kind of conversations to be incredible, and they're always really enlightening. But it took a lot of bravery and um, a lot of fortitude to stick with that project because
Yeah.
not everyone was in favor of it. There's um, organizations and individuals who came out strongly against it.
Right.
And I always, he's my friend, he was my boss, but I try to be impartial with Eric, and I tell you that there's nobody else that could have steered the town, steered the community, and steered the organization and all these people through the fuller story without the sort of dedication and bravery that he had to it. To see this done and done the right way.
Yeah.
Um, and in a way too to be more honest and more open about the town's whole history. This is
Right.
it's a town where slavery existed, Civil War happened, and bad things, bad racial relations unfolded. Um, and today it's a place where we can go and we can think about those things. We can reflect on them. And I always say challenge ourselves to do better than the past, but that's that's one man's optimistic viewpoint, I guess. I'm an idealist.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that's history's challenge to all of us is to try to improve upon ourselves and make things better in the future.
Yeah. I
So
see Ann's
Ann
question.
asks, weren't most Unionists in Tennessee in the East? Were there where there weren't plantations, so to speak?
Sort of, kind of, yes, mostly. That's a good way to answer that. So, if we look at the secession breakdown in 1861, uh, Tennessee actually votes in February of 1861 to stay in the Union, and that vote's about 52% in favor of remaining, 48% to leave. The majority of the vote to stay naturally comes from the East, and that is kind of to Anne's point. There's not a lot of farming that can be done there. It's more mountainous, more rocky. The climate is not necessarily conducive to massive farming like you see in the mid-state or in West Tennessee.
Yeah.
So there's a lower dependence on slave labor in the eastern portion of the state, thus less of a tendency to want to secede. Um, West Tennessee, a lot more farming, much more agriculturally based, heavier slave population, thus heavier vote to secede from the Union. Middle Tennessee is a great deciding ground, though. It's kind
Mm.
of this, it's a mix of both, right? You have a Unionist streak here, and you have a secessionist streak, two towns over. Um, but I think what's important for us to really focus on from that area of Middle Tennessee, particularly kind of Nashville down to Columbia,
Right.
that is an area that is even in 1860 um, rife with Union sentiment, and it's because of who's from there, who lived there. Just up the road is Andrew Jackson. Just down south in Columbia is James K. Polk. Two presidents who, warts and all, and there's a lot of flaws, a lot of warts, all these things, always kind of pressed the notion that the United States, the country, was the kind of the leader, right? The
Right.
country is important. The country should be the this kind of you know the greatest country in the world. All these things, right? So Jackson's always about expansion, and really the big point comes in 1830. They're in the
Yeah.
nullification crisis when he fights with John C. Calhoun, saying, a state doesn't like something. Well, that's too bad. The federal government is the authority. You have to listen to the federal government. That impresses people like Randall McGavock, who then passes on that sentiment to his son John McGavock, who then in February of 1861 votes against secession because he's a Unionist. They're
Yeah.
Jacksonian Democrats. They still existed. They're a minority, but they still existed. And you can say the same thing about the people in Murray County. They vote they vote for secession both times. But
Yeah.
even then, there's parties within Murray County that vote to stay in the Union. Um, and but along then comes the June vote, and that really becomes the deciding piece of ground is that Middle Tennessee ultimately will vote. Many of the counties will vote to secede from the Union, but you still see the same thing out of East Tennessee, heavy opposition to secession.
Yeah.
And it is just like Ann said, there's not plantations, so there's not heavy farming, so there's not heavy slave dependency. But
Yeah.
it's a lot more nuanced sometimes than we paint it. It's the same thing about saying, the whole South was in favor of secession, so every Southerner was a Confederate. Well, that's just not the case. There's
Right. Right.
always the exception to every rule. Yeah.
Yeah. It was extremely complicated, topic. I mean, Western North Carolina was in the same position as Eastern
Yeah.
Tennessee. My own ancestor, James Anderson, was pressed into service because of the Conscription Act. So
Yeah.
he didn't really have a choice. So,
Yeah.
but at the beginning of all of this, I picked that video clip to put as the opening for a reason. You had said those words, and we were standing there on that property talking about the battle together that day, and just kind of going through it briefly before I headed out onto the field and check everything else out. And it wasn't too long after that I traveled all the way down to Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, to watch Journey in concert. And as I'm sitting in the stands, hey man,
I'm
I love
sorry.
Journey. What can I say?
Sorry. God bless you.
So I'm down there watching this concert, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, everybody's phone starts to blow up. And I've had this great trip so far, and the next thing I know, they're talking about, oh, there's assassination attempt, and it's the only thing people are talking about the entire way.
Mhm.
And I'm sitting here thinking, to myself, man, me and Joseph, we were just having this conversation the other day about how we're not quite as divided as everybody's trying to make us out to be. But then we still have these outliers that are pushing in and trying to create division within people in our country still today.
Yeah. They always exist. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is there's always commentary. There's always going to be um, something that pushes us to hate our neighbor, right?
Yeah.
Um, I'm sure people probably wouldn't love my politics, and I probably don't love everybody else's politics. Um, but I don't see that as the weakness, right? I see that as the strength. Is that the the thing that really set this country back has already really been decided for 200 or 160 years ago this year, right? Uh, by removing, as Robert Penn Warren, the great writer, he said that in fighting the Civil War, the United States removed from itself its most serious impediment to a perpetual union. Now, that doesn't mean that the war necessarily, you know, cured all ills, fixed all evils, and set everybody right. And we still saw even immediately after the war resistance to this new approach, right? This idea of freedom and equality before the law. Um, and I don't know. I guess maybe in this place and time, and all of the things that have gone on in the last 3, 4 months and 5 months since the election, well, I guess maybe my thoughts have changed a little bit, right? Is that sometimes there is this division, there is this us and them. Um, but I think when we look back at the 19th century, look back at the Civil War generation, these were people whose lives were interrupted, upended. 4 million people yearned to be free, and it took 4 years and 750,000 men's lives. And when it was over, the country was saved. Slavery would be abolished eventually, ultimately, but we still had to work, right? And
Yeah.
that's part of the thing now is we still have to work. You know, just because you pretend that racism and inequality don't exist doesn't mean that they don't. They're still there, right? And when we pretend that we're not divided and we're not at least some polarized, not polarized, at least somewhere, right? Um, it doesn't mean that we're not. It means that we just have to accept that we probably won't agree on everything. But
Right.
that is, I mean, I think I told you this even then, is I think that this is the great thing about the country is that we don't all have to agree with everything. There's always going to be someone that will be counter to it, right? Um,
Right.
there's always going to be the people that want to be detractors and always want to hate on the nation. But I think love of country is healthy when you accept that country has faults, right?
Yeah.
And the biggest thing is to continue to do the work to, I think, really to honor the sacrifices of the men who died 150 years ago in the struggle of the Civil War. But if you stop there and you just stop after the Civil War, we really haven't gotten to see the full fruition of what that vision was, right? When Lincoln talks about a new birth of freedom, he's not just talking about, well, what would happen in 1865 and 1866, even though he wouldn't live to see it. He's talking about something 100 years in the future. And
Mm.
that it took 100 years is another, I guess, testament that it continues to take work, right? But the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all of those things push us closer and closer to the ideals that we began with. But like I said, it takes the work to continue to push, right? It takes the work to continue to love the country, but to know that it needs improvements, and you have to commit yourself to it. And I guess I probably sound like I'm crazy saying this, but um, I don't know. I think that's what makes the experiment work is that we can tinker with it. We can make it better. Uh, and it's democracy is a fragile thing. Our country is a
Yeah.
fragile thing. Rule of law is a fragile thing. And it will always take people standing up and saying, no, you can't do that, or advocating for improvements that need to be made. Yeah. I guess I guess maybe I think a little bit differently now than I did 6 months ago, but I still
Hey.
try and keep a level head about it.
Yeah. No, I can understand. I mean, and realistically, I think that that's what makes it all work out. Anyways, is there's always somebody there that's willing to take the chance and believe. And when it comes right down to it, at the end of the day, the people that serve and sacrifice on a regular day-to-day basis and put their lives on the line, those people are doing that because they believe in what this country is about. They believe in what we can be, not just what we are. So,
Yeah, and I think that's it.
well,
Is it's not who we are, it's not who we were, it's what we can become. And that's the ultimate, you know, when I go to places like the National Cemetery at Stones River, when I go to Arlington, in the past when I visited Europe and saw the American cemeteries there, you know, those guys didn't die for nothing, right? They
yeah,
died to save the world from tyranny, to save the world from despots and dictators. And, you know, I think it's incumbent upon us to remember that, you know, that when if you wrap yourself in a flag and you say that you love the country and then you do things to the detriment of the country, you're not you're not really hurting me. You're dishonoring the men that are in those cemeteries. So
that's
yeah,
true.
there we go. That's me. That's it. That's the end of it.
That's there you are. Well, Joseph, it's been a pleasure having you on here. I mean, I could sit here all night and talk forever, but I know you've got some responsibilities to take care of for sure. Um, what do you got coming up? Let's let everybody know what's on your plate in the future.
Yeah, so I am the host of Homebrew History podcast. Homebrew History is it's a show with myself and my best friend, my old roommate, Bo Trissler. We bring on various guests and historians and have people come on. If it's not topical, sometimes it's, you know, they're a host of another history podcast. They come on, talk a little bit. Always writing, always researching. You can follow along on the Emerging Civil Wars website. Um, Emerging Civil War is just a great kind of voice out there in the Civil War community. And then two, on my own personal research, I've got sort of two books going on at the same time, trying to write both. It's not easy to do two at once. But a book that I hope will tell a very important and incredible story about the first major racial clash, racial confrontation post World War II about the Columbia Race Riot in 1946, and then a biography of General George Wagner that's been in the works for 7 or 8 years now. But both of those hopefully um, will be out by the end of the year, or at least be in publication by the end of the year. So that's
Very cool.
that's that. But you can follow along with all that on Homebrew Histories podcast, and then two, my social medias I'm on Blue Sky. I got annoyed with Twitter.
Okay. Well, very good. So you heard it from the man himself. You definitely got to go check out the homebrew history. And I love tuning in over there and checking that out myself. So if you haven't been over, give it a look. And thanks, Joseph, for stopping by and being on here and giving us some really detailed information here on this channel about Franklin and various other topics we've talked about.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
yeah, it's a delight. Awesome. Thanks for having me, Charlie.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to everybody tuning in out there and asking those questions. And we'll see you around for things to come.